Hey ANPers, this is Dr. Jones checking in. This is ANP1 Lecture Test 3 Video 10. I'll write this down. And we're on Noteset page 11. And we are talking about fractures, types of fractures, and fracture repair. So let's talk about how to repair a fracture. Then we'll come back to this picture and look at the types of fractures. All right, so fractures are repaired in 4 steps. Number 1 is bleeding, and it produces a clot called a fracture hematoma. Fracture means break, and hema means blood. And then fracture is abbreviated FX. There's a capital X. Prescription is RX. Diagnosis is DX. Fractures FX. There's another one. What's the other one? All right, put it in the comments on YouTube if you can remember. Number 2 is callus formation. So this is, it makes a bump, it grows a bump. And the bump on the outside is the external callus, and the bump on the inside is the internal callus. So this is all number 2. External callus, cartilage, and bone surrounds the break. And of course you make a hyaline cartilage model and then you replace that with bone. So it's effectively endochondral ossification is how you do fracture repair. And the internal callus happens inside, external callus is the bump on the outside. See, hyaline cartilage, blood vessels, replace it with bone. Number 3, and let's get me out of the way. Number 3 is spongy bone formation, where you replace this central bit with spongy bone. And this part too, yeah, spongy bone. Spongy bone, as you recall, are made of trabeculi, which are formed along stress lines and cross-braced. So scaffolding of bone. Yeah. And then number 4, now I'm even more in the way. Compact bone formation, and then over time this external callus will be remodeled, and usually within a year of on a weight-bearing bone. This is gone, this is a humerus, of course. If it's not a weight-bearing bone, then it may never be remodeled away. The clavicles, the collarbones here, are not weight-bearing bones on humans, and so when they fracture, there's usually a bump, and there's usually at least 2 people in every room of 60 students who still have a visible bump on their collarbone that they can show you. Another bone that is not weight-bearing is the fibula. Remember, the tibias are medial and the fibulas are lateral. And those fibulas, those tiny little bones, great big long skinny little bones that contain the lateral malleolus, they're not weight-bearing bones, and so if they break, they also, when they heal, that external callus tends to maintain, it tends to be maintained, it tends to persist nevertheless. And it stays a bump on the fibula. Remember, the fibulas are lateral, la for lateral, fibula for lateral. Tibia is medial, fibula is lateral. And if you don't spell those correctly on the lab test, they're wrong. And there's a couple words that are like exactly halfway in between tibia and fibula, and they're all wrong. That was 4. All right, so let's go back and talk about the types of fractures now. Here we go. Our book treats a closed fracture and a simple fracture as the same thing, and an open fracture and a compound fracture as the same thing. They're not. So a closed fracture is a fracture that does not break through the surface of the skin. An open fracture is a fracture that breaks through the surface of the skin. Okay, a simple fracture is a single break. No chips, not crushed, just a nice simple snap. Okay. A compound fracture is more than one break. Maybe there's a chip broken out, maybe it's crushed, maybe there's lots of little fractures in there, but not a simple fracture compound. More complicated. Okay, so a transverse fracture, you can see right here, it goes through the bone, across the long axis of the bone, transverse across. A displaced versus non-displaced. So here's a displaced fracture. Dis means like un and placed. So it's not lined up anymore, it's displaced. If it's a non-displaced, then it's not displaced, so it's still placed. Complicated, right? It's like a double negative. So a non-displaced fracture is still lined up, so it doesn't need to be set. A displaced fracture needs to be set, usually after you give them some pain meds. Compression fracture is where it just crushes in on itself, and it's usually here, as you see, the vertebral body fractures. And these are common fractures that happen with age in elderly people or people with advanced osteopenia into osteoporosis, which we'll talk about in this video, because this is the last chapter 6 video, the last page in chapter 6. Where was I? Compression fractures. So this is part of why you see elderly people have a kyphosis. A kyphosis, let me spell it. Just a second. A kyphosis is an extra curve forward. So, but the eyes are always completely straight to the horizon. So when you get these vertebral fractures, usually the neck will come up. And these vertebral fractures hurt like Hades for months, like 3 to 4 months, and there's like nothing you can do for them. Except what they can do is they can inject them with this cement, not concrete. Concrete's got like rocks in it. Cement and concrete are different. Anyway, they inject it with this stuff to plump those vertebral bodies back to their original height. Now, why do they do this? What's the problem with a kyphosis? Well, give yourself a temporary here. Extreme kyphosis, and take a deep breath. Not much breath there, right? Now sit up straight, shoulders back, chest out, tummy in. Take a nice deep breath. You feel the difference in the amount of oxygen you can get into your lungs? That is why they treat a kyphosis, because the more severe the kyphosis is, the less rib mobility you have. And when you decrease rib mobility, you decrease lung function. And when you take off lung function, you take years off of your life. It literally decreases life expectancy. That's why in people with a scoliosis, and this would be from the front, but there'd be like an abnormal curvature in the spine. But again, head, eyes are always like this way. After a certain degree of scoliosis, they will go in and surgically implant a metal bar. And then they have this like bone growth dust stuff when they put it down, and so you like no spinuses. No, they like cut all the spinuses out, and then there's just like a ridge instead of spinuses, and the x-rays are crazy. But the reason why they do this is because past a certain degree of scoliosis, and it starts to literally take years off of your lifespan. So that's why they look so carefully for scoliosis, because it makes a difference long term. And so what they do for a kyphosis, for these compression fractures, the vertebral body fractures, is they inject them and plump them back up. Now the problem with this is if you have enough osteoporosis to get a vertebral body fracture, a crush fracture there, a compression fracture, then the vertebral bodies above and below are also guaranteed soft. And now you've injected the broken one with cement. And so now you've got super soft bones bumping against this cement. They are going to crush above and below that cement injection. And then you go in and inject those. And then a few months later, the next two go. And then you inject those, and maybe this one, or maybe that one. And it's like a kind of a whack-a-mole game with the compression fractures. And they know that this is part of the process. Why do it? Oxygen. Oxygen is life. And so they do treat these compression fractures with these injections, even though they know it will cause more compression fractures, because that way, and it's not about not losing your height as you get older, it's about keeping the rib cage mobile so that you can breathe and get oxygen. The other term here is lordosis. And let's see, this kyphosis picture is a side view. Here, lordosis is a side view. It's where you have like somebody who's pregnant and their belly's sticking way out and their low back is curved way in. That's a lordosis. So I don't have a picture of that for you here, do I? Okay, so that was a compression fracture. Spiral fractures tend to happen in kids because they have more kind of flexible bones, and it's when a twisting has happened. Usually when you hear of somebody getting a spiral fracture, it's usually they've been like snow skiing and the ski got caught and the whole twisted and the whole leg twisted and a spiral fracture, and they friggin' suck to heal because it's like a spiral fracture up the bone. And yeah. Okay, so an epiphyseal fracture is a dangerous type of fracture because it's the growth plate. It's a fracture at the growth plate. Again, this tends to happen in kids, and it can disrupt the growth in that growth plate, in which case it will not grow there anymore. So that can cause issues. Okay. Comminuted fracture is where you get lots of chips, little bony fragments, all these little bits of bone here. Comminuted fracture. And a green stick fracture also is more likely to happen in kids. It's literally what happens if you bend a green, fresh off the tree stick. Because it's flexible, it snaps apart on the convex side, but just bends on the concave side. So you only get a fracture part of the way into the bone, and part of it has just flexed, and then the top part fractures apart. But so it's like a transverse fracture, but not all the way through the bone. Okay. Call's fracture, the distal radius. And let's see if we can get my head out of the way. The distal radius, and this is the catch yourself on when you're falling and you catch yourself on an arm, and the weight goes up the radius, and that's what snaps. And then a Pott's fracture, I believe I mentioned in the lab videos, this is a bimalleolar fracture. The Pott's fracture, the medial malleolus and the lateral malleolus have both snapped. So you have very little muscular control over your foot. You have a flopping foot that you do not have control over. Now there is a lip on the back of the tibia, and if it's not a malleolus, but if that one also snaps, then you have a trimalleolar fracture, and either way you're going in for surgery for plates and screws and implantanium and all kinds of good stuff. Okay, and so fractures and fracture repair. So let's talk about osteopenia versus osteoporosis. So osteopenia is inadequate ossification. And this tends to happen in women earlier than men because, sorry, I'm going to sit on my feet. Because women undergo menopause earlier than men undergo andropause by like 2 or 3 decades. Usually 40s in women and usually 70s in men. So that lack of sex hormones, which strengthens, causes a growth, muscle and bone growth. So that lack of sex hormones after menopause causes a weakening of the bones over time. Now, that's osteopenia, which is just inadequate ossification. Osteoporosis is the one that you've heard of. And osteoporosis is when the osteopenia has gotten bad enough to compromise function. So if the bone has broken, then it clearly has osteoporosis because it's no longer functioning. Now, yeah, it clearly has osteoporosis because it's enough osteopenia to cause a fracture. Okay. So osteopenia is an imbalance in the activity levels of what 2 types of bone cells? Osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And which one is too active? Osteoclasts. You got it. And then let's see. Ooh, a quiz. Forgot about that. Okay. What are the 5 functions of the skeleton? I'm going to let you read these. You should be able to draw this bone picture in your sleep. Like literally while you're falling asleep. Yeah. Okay. And this is a picture of my honey hubby and my kids when they were teensy. Look how teeny they were. He's my height now, which is about there. And she comes up to about like here on me now. So my son's 14 now and my daughter's 11. But they're both December babies, so both and half as I record this. And this is on Fulton Beach Pier, which no longer exists because Harvey. So, but we used to go and watch the fish in the lights. Okay, so this has been ANP1 lecture test 3, video 10. Page 11, wherein we covered the fracture pages, the fracture page and the last of chapter 6. So for our next trick, we will cover page 12 and start chapter 9. Thank you as always for tuning in. It's good to virtually see you here. The education must go on. Dr. J out.